Hey everyone, welcome to Being with Cari. This is the podcast where I speak with previous guests of the Ultimate Coach podcast. And tonight's guest is Mr. Seth Pepper. Seth, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. We're excited to talk to you tonight. You were actually just recently on the Ultimate Coach podcast and you spoke with EPEC. You were on episode 114, and the title was The Blueprint of Becoming from Visualization to Victory. Now, I listened to this podcast. This was an incredibly powerful podcast where you spoke a lot about in your youth, starting in your youth, and how you have incorporated visualization into the victories that you have created throughout your life. And you said something really interesting in that podcast that I would like to start with. Just a little bit of background for anybody who hasn't heard it yet. He was, correct me if I'm wrong, excuse me, the national champion swimming.
Yes.
Perfect. So you said you told a story about how your aunt was at one of your meets
Mm.
and she spoke about here what she said. I knew you had won the race before you even started by the way you were standing.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to go too deep into the actual visualization practice itself, but I want to go into that. Because I think for people who are listening to the podcast, people who are in this self-awareness or this being world, I think that to me was interesting that of that manifestation process, that's one more step of being, like you said, making the future normal.
Mm.
Speak a little more about that, if you will.
Yeah, I'd love to. So my aunt, um, nurse from New York City, had never been to any competitions like this. She had never been to any of my competitions. So it was kind of a unique experience for all of us. And so she was watching me and she could just tell. She's, as you said, knew that it was over before it even began. And, more on that was I just stood there with a presence, that I would probably call it poise, with a sort of you're patient and powerful at the same time. You're completely present in that moment. You're not trying to be anyone other than who you are at that moment. And I think she could just tell. I've tried to incorporate incorporate that with the coaching that I do now, which is that you want to have that poise, that power of poise, and that really stands out. When we watch a group of people, it's always the tends to be the person that's just present and they're not rushing things. They're allowing, if we're talking about sports, they're allowing the game to come to them rather than them chasing after the game. So,
Okay. So to me, that sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like by that point, when you're standing there and you're being that, that is something that you've already decided. That's not something where you're standing there and saying, I'm going to be this. That's something that's just already integrated in you. Is that correct?
yes, if you incorporate the visualization or some sort of, I actually used to call it time travel. So to me, it was like, every day I'd go to this imaginary movie theater and I'd watch this movie and I'd do it on a regular basis. And then when I finally was there in that moment, it was like I got to invite everyone else into this movie theater for a shared experience. And so I had rehearsed it so many times that when I actually was there doing it, it was okay, everybody gets to experience what I've been experiencing all this time, and now it's official. So it's more of, you know, just a presence feeling of I've been here before. This is familiar, and isn't this great? I was interviewed afterwards, and it was interesting because you might imagine what you might say after you achieve your sort of lifetime dreams. and it was way different than I thought it would be. I just
Mhm.
started really just sharing love. It was just pouring out of me. It was like my chest was exploding. And I wasn't really a person that talked about love. I'm a college athlete, and it's not something that was really talked about a whole lot. Even in my family, it wasn't really talked about that much. But I just was expressing love, and I just kept on saying, I love this sport. I love my teammates. I just loved everything. So it was an experience of love.
I think that's amazing. Do you find that that is something that when you accomplish other goals or bring forth other manifestations that you have those same sort of feelings?
Yes, I do. With the work that I do now, I study the greats. In the sports world, they might call them the GOATs, greatest of all time is what that stands for. Um, and I'm looking for something, a pattern that's familiar. So I had my pattern, and the pattern usually shows up out of necessity, right? In in nature, necessity is the mother of all invention. So I created this great necessity in my life to achieve my dreams. And so when I study the greats, one that sticks out was Kobe Bryant. And one of my favorite clips on Kobe is he's asked this question: what characteristic do all the greats have in common? And he goes, that's easy. Love. We
Really?
love what we do, and we're in love with what we are doing. And he says something towards the end. It's a very short clip, but he says at the very end, it's not about the fame, it's not about the money, it's not even about the championships. We just study what we love. And that word study is always the word that I try to highlight with people. That's not just an athlete, that's everyone. You study what you love. You go back and you examine it and you go over it and you get curious about it. And that's a form of the process of falling in love. And you can put whatever you want in that sentence of whatever you're falling in love with, whatever you're becoming what I would call obsessed about. That's the part of creation. And that's what I try to get people deeper and deeper into. Of course, everybody has different words, so I'm not necessarily
Mm.
going to jump right at the word love, but eventually I do. Now that we're obsessed, you realize obsessed is just another way of falling in love with something. And by then they're like, okay, yeah, I'd agree with you.
And that's so interesting. While you were talking, what came up for me was all of these things that aren't sport related and how study and love applies that. I was like, well, if you're interested in engines, you take them apart and put them back together and take them apart and put it back together. If you're interested in photography, you just get out there and take, and I was like, that it's true. And I think society puts such a stigma on studying that it has to be learning something new where it could be learning more of what you already know. And
Exactly.
and I think there's a lot of people that run around and learn a little bit of a lot of things and but they really don't know a whole lot. And so automatically I'm thinking back to my life and I'm like, oh yeah, I've done that at times. And why do I still feel stuck? Why do I
Yeah.
still feel like I don't know anything? Because I've learned all this stuff. Well, I didn't really study it.
Yeah. You say it beautifully. It really is. I say that there's two planets. There's the planet of knowing, and there's the planet of doing. And in the times that we live in now, through the internet, we're connected to as much information as we'll ever need, more or less. So I'll start with just a blunt statement saying, I'm not going to teach you anything new, which usually, can cause a reaction.
For sure.
I'm just going to remind you of something or things that and we're just going to bring them to the surface and I'm going to hold the space for how simple it really is. And then we're going to go out and apply it. And then we're going to come back and we're going to compare notes. And then we're going to go out and, make a change. Maybe usually it's a small change. And then we're going to apply it again under pressure. And that's the process that, is that to me is mastery, which is you're striving for perfection while simultaneously understanding that perfection, it's not possible. But you fall in love with the process of mastery. So I just said this to a really great golfer. I said, you don't need to love golf, but I think it's necessary to love the process of becoming really good at something, which is mastery, the pursuit of mastery. And once they realize, okay, and that could be a relationship too, a relationship with another person or a relationship with you fill in the blanks. You you're going to have moments of possibly being in love. That's not life. Life's not it's not sustainable. It's kind of like a sine wave. It goes up and it goes down. But over time, we want to be committed to the process. So we want to be able to fall in love with the process of getting better and just keeping that simple. And that takes the pressure off of or the expectation of I need to feel euphoric all the time.
Mhm.
No, that
Yeah.
is not this process.
And I love how you use the word simple,
Yeah,
and yet in your explanation of it, it's not easy, but it is simple. It's
exactly.
it's something that's easy to grasp and harder to implement, but absolutely worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, you said it perfectly. It's simple, but a lot of times simple is not easy. And it actually gets harder because it is simple. And then once you put something under pressure or stress, that's when simple gets really hard, can get really hard. And so I'm just trying to hold the space for the doing rather than the knowing. And then we just come back around, it's the feedback loop where you go out, you put something under pressure, you get information on how it performed, and then you make a small adjustment and then you do it again. And it's just a simple loop. And that's learning anything. That could be learning in a relationship, that could be learning, a child learning math in school, it could be someone hitting a golf ball at the highest level of the performance. That's that's the space I work in.
That's wonderful. I love that. Now, how can people get a hold of you if they want to work with you? Where can they find you?
Seth Pepper at .com. I mean, it's pretty simple. It's also all the different handles,
Okay,
so all of the social media platforms for the most part. I've just my full name.
wonderful. Wonderful. Well, we are running out of time here. I would love to talk further, but I want to encourage everybody to go back and listen to your podcast because you go into this on a much deeper level and share other stories that are very applicable that people can relate to. And I want to remind everybody, so Seth was on the Ultimate Coach podcast, episode 114, The Blueprint of Becoming from Visualization to Victory. Seth, anything else that you would like to share before we close tonight?
I just always want to encourage people to go after their dreams. I know we hear that all the time. I've been able to achieve mine and continue to help my brother, my father, my family, and then now helping others. And so it's just a really practical manifestation of of dreams, of going out there and applying these principles. And, over time, they truly do happen. This is a real, very real, practical process that I just want to encourage people to fall in love with.
Well, thanks again for being here on the show. Thanks for taking the time tonight. And we look forward to hearing from you again. Anybody that wants to connect with Seth Pepper, at any of the handles or sethpepper.com. Correct?
Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thanks, Seth. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful night.